morning and welcome. My name is Chris Kinane, Research Director for Supply Chain Management at ARC Advisory Group, and want to thank you for joining us today as we explore supply chain disruption and digital transformation. So I have a couple slides to kind of go over to sort of set the stage for it, and then we'll get into the discussion with Greg and Richard. So before we get started, just the obligatory housekeeping notes. So first and foremost, please silence your devices. We are recording all these sessions, so that'll make it much easier on the people recording this. And we'll be using this at our virtual forum in a couple weeks, and I'm sure we'll use the content for other things throughout the year. We ask that, for any sessions you're attending, obviously we appreciate your feedback. So you can give feedback through the app for this session and any other sessions, and also be sure to check the app for any updates to conference events and schedules. And again, please silence your devices. So let's kind of kick it off. I just want to, set the stage about supply chains, right? So at the early going of COVID, I would say that supply chain professionals were truly heroic, right? They were working long hours in very stressful situations. And this is especially true of truck drivers, delivery drivers, warehouse workers, right? So, they were really at the front lines of helping keep the economy going at that point. During this time, a lot of companies discovered sort of new talent, new business processes to help deal with all the disruptions going on. But, it's one of those things that it wasn't necessarily sustainable. So it leads to the question of, are supply chains broken? Thankfully, the answer is no, but they are strained, right? So, there's external forces that are continuing to impact global supply chains. And this is sort of the new normal that we're going to have to deal with all of these disruptions. And it's really going to be a combination of people, processes, and technology coexisting to help weather the storm throughout these disruptions. So what is the new normal? I think it's a combination of disruptions across a number of different categories. So we see delays, right, in getting raw materials. So this leads to breakdowns at the factories, right? So this then impacts logistics and shipping. And then it trickles down into the distribution centers. So the distribution centers are having delays getting products in, getting products out. So this then impacts availability in stores, impacts availability through, online shopping as well. And in the end, it ends up hitting the end customer because, let's face it, customers, we all have certain expectations. We want the product we want, when we want it, and we want, how we want to get it, right? We have very firm and very concrete ideas around this. And these disruptions are impacting this. So it's really hitting the end-to-end supply chain at this point. And, while things, they're not as bad as they were during the onset of COVID, supply chains, they're not necessarily what they used to be. And so a term that I've actually come across lately, and this was actually a discussion with my colleague Steve Banker, he kind of turned me on to this, is a polycrisis. So this is where there's multiple crises going on at once. So it's crisis A plus crisis B plus crisis C all at the same time, sort of triggers a polycrisis or a mega crisis, right? And so these are causing supply chain disruptions, and we're hearing about them every day from, an economic standpoint, a climate standpoint, a war standpoint, and ongoing labor issues, right? So right now, sort of the combination of the lingering effects of COVID, the ongoing war in Ukraine, as well as a looming recession and climate issues are really causing a lot of disruptions. So I think a lot of it comes down to which of these are sort of longer term disruptions for supply chains and which are shorter term. So, I think in the long term, free trade breakdowns and the ongoing labor shortages, especially when you look at labor shortages in the warehousing and trucking industries, those will be sort of the longer lasting disruptions that will continue to impact supply chains. When you look at it on the shorter term, more frequent extreme weather events are obviously, and that's been a big thing talking about, climate change lately. So these ongoing or, continual weather events that are causing delays, whether that's at the ports or within infrastructure, is going to be probably one of the biggest things. And then a looming recession, will obviously have a big impact on supply chains as well. So part of the solution is to deal with all these disruptions is all about supply chain agility and supply chain resilience. Now, a lot of business professionals want to talk about agility and resilience as if they're the same thing. They're not. They're both incredibly important, and companies need to look at both of them. But there are some subtle differences. So, agility refers to the company's ability to sort of quickly change its strategy, whether that's for procurement, delivery, inventory management, right? And to, sort of meet the changing realities of supply chain. So it's kind of like, the wide receiver that can stop on a dime, change direction, right? That's agility right there. Supply chain resilience, on the other hand, it refers to the ability to prepare for disruptions and prepare for unexpected events and then respond to them while keeping business operations going. So this is more like, the boxer that can take a beating and then continue to battle throughout the rest of the match. So that sort of sets the stage a little bit for what we want to talk about today is with supply chain disruption. And one thing that we would like for this panel is to make sure that it's interactive. So if you have questions, comments, feedback, we want to address those. So, put your hand up. I think we might have some handheld mics. You can ask questions. I've also instructed our panelists that they have the ability to just point at one of you and ask you a question, ask you what you're thinking. So be prepared, and you've been forewarned. So at this point, let's jump into the discussion, and I want to welcome my two panelists up here. So we have, I'll let each of you introduce yourselves. So Richard, why don't you go first?
I'm Richard Herrin. I'm currently the Director of Integrated Business Planning for Geon Performance Solutions. Geon's a compounding company. So plastic, you ever see plastic resin coming off a line, right? Little pellets, little gooey things, right? You ever wonder how that gets into all the different forms that we see plastic right now? Well, it's compounded, right? We add additives, modifiers to make it either rigid, make it flexible. We add additives to give it different properties. We add colorants. And then we sell it to end groups who extrude it into the products you see, not building products, appliances, anything plastic. Okay.
Great. And Greg?
And we're on a little bit of the opposite end of that. We're on the consuming end. So Greg Toornman with AGCO Corporation. We manufacture farm equipment for the agricultural industry. We're the third largest in the world. Many of you probably don't know our products. 75% of our business is outside. Within that, AGCO across our global value chain has 44 assembly plants, 38 distribution centers, and service 2,400 outside dealer networks as part of our value chain. We have products that in some cases have bill of materials that are 28, 30,000, SKUs deep, and the other end of the spectrum, maybe some that are around 6,000. So we have a wide range of product all operating in the, we call a mixed model assembly process, where we do consume a lot of rigid plastics in certain parts of our equipment.
Great, thanks again for joining me today. So, I want to start off by really understanding the scope of your supply chain. Kind of give us an idea of what's most important to your customers, what's really driving your supply chain. So, Richard, how about we start with you on this one?
Yeah, sure. So all the different plastic, our formulations are our competitive advantage, right? Being able to go to our end customer with compounded formulations that work for them, bring value to them. That's a better way to describe this. Our competitive advantage is in that partnership with that end product, right? If you think about it, it probably doesn't take a lot of engineering to do compounding, but to do special formulations, to do something that's going to give somebody like an auto manufacturer, right? They want certain parts, plastic parts on that car to last 10, 15 years, right? And so we have to build the formulations to give them that. Yep.
That does. And Greg, can you tell me a little bit about sort of the scope of your supply chain and what's most important to your customers?
So we've got a strategy called Farmer First, and within that, across the organization, it's really driving how do we best support our farmers in the field that are feeding the world. And for many of you, you probably read the news, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 million people across this planet that are basically considered not having enough nutrition to survive. So for us, it's a challenge that we take on not just from a profitability perspective, but also something that's the right thing to do socially. So what's important for our customers? Their ability to utilize their farm equipment when they need it. Why is that? Because as I just mentioned, there's 80 million plus people in the world that don't have enough to eat. We've only got so many square meters of farmland that we can utilize. And within that, our ability to utilize that farmland effectively and sometimes combating weather conditions becomes a big driver. So within that, the reliability of our products becomes a vital element of importance to our customers. When you look at customer loyalty and repurchase, what are some of the things that are most important to them? The ability to keep their products operating when they want to use them. So within that, the aftermarket service and support that we provide is usually in the top 1 or 2 in terms of repurpose drivers. And as a result of that, our supply chains need to be resilient and supporting our customers in the field when they need us at the most crucial times, right? And it really doesn't matter why something broke, because it's tough conditions. It's up to us to provide them solutions proactively that enable them to do their jobs.
Great. So, in my introduction, obviously, I talked about, different categories of disruptions that we've been facing, especially over the last couple of years. So I want to take a little deeper dive into a few of these categories of disruptions and see how it impacted your business and sort of what you guys, what you saw and how you reacted to it. So, Greg, I want to start with you, and, we'll start with the COVID pandemic. How were you impacted, and what actions did, your company take to limit the disruptions, but then continue to operate during this time?
So we run a very, what we call integrated value chain network across the globe, where we're meeting with the supply chain leads pretty much on a regular basis, weekly, sometimes every other week. So when we were sitting in the Shanghai airport, and I was on one of these calls on December the 6th, 2019, one of my colleagues said, there's something happening down in the Wuhan area. We're starting to hear from suppliers that things are happening. A few weeks go by, and next thing you know, it's starting to impact Chinese New Year. And next thing you know, they're talking about having extended Chinese New Year. At that point in time, we started to understand from a data perspective what was driving governmental decisions. So we basically mapped the rising COVID rates to the hospital critical care unit occupancy rates and could determine predictively when a region, whether that's a city, a state, or province, would start to impact shutdowns, mandatory shutdowns at that point in time. We then mapped that to our supply base with our risk management software called Risk Methods. And within that, we were able to predictably determine 2 to 3 weeks ahead of time in South Korea as well as Japan when things would start to happen. We propagated that same thinking into Italy, and then Germany, and then France, and then Brazil, and then North America. We never gained so much market share in 1 year as what we did in 2020 as a result of our supply chain's competitive advantage in the marketplace by utilizing data coupled with some creative people, as well as our information systems to determine what could happen, what actions do we need to take. And as a result of that, we were really, really well rewarded by our customers and some of our competitors' customers as well.
And Richard, how about you? How was Geon impacted by COVID, and what steps did you take?
Yeah. So the first thing is the shutdowns, right? The shutdowns first started with the customers, right? Our customers were canceling orders, and look, I don't have people to even offload the trucks if you send them. And then internally, right, we had people couldn't show up to work, right? You can't turn a valve remotely, right? Working from home. So our vendor lead times immediately started tripling, going from what was 30-day lead times to 90-day lead times, 120-day lead times, and on. It just threw a huge monkey wrench into any of our planning, right? You don't have confidence that your raw materials are going to show up on time. You don't have confidence that I'm going to have enough people to run the line. And you don't have, even if we do that and we produced a product, you don't have confidence that the customer is going to ultimately take it because they're suffering the same things we are, right?
Right. So, well, that actually brings me to sort of my next point, and it ties into COVID, and it's all around. There's a major impact on raw material and sort of product availability. Shortages left and right. So, what actions were you able to take to deal with and handle these shortages? Start with you on this one, Richard.
Yeah. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you we did anything that really worked well, right? everything was a fire drill. Everything was, we spent, every one of us in there, we spend years trying to figure out how do we get our raw material costs down, whether you offshore it or you have longer lead times, and all of a sudden, well, okay, I got to find somebody. When the ports were backing up, well, who in the U.S. can supply us all this kind of stuff? Well, wait a minute, I don't have that formulation qualified. So we had technical people round the clock trying to reformulate with different raw material vendor suppliers. We had, we couldn't get, every day we had a COVID report. How many people were out with COVID? You go, okay, well, the people who don't have COVID, let's see if we can keep them healthy because they're going to be doing a heck of a lot of overtime right now just to keep up. Things like that. Looking back, we learned a lot, and we learned that, well, we didn't plan for this. If we would have planned for these kind of cases, maybe we could have gotten through it a little better than we did. It brute force with everybody, though, right, trying to get through it.
Yeah, and I think that was definitely one of the takeaways that a lot of companies had was we weren't prepared for this. How do we start making these contingency plans for the future? So, Greg, back to you, as far as the product and material shortages, what actions was AGCO able to take?
So similar to what I mentioned before, when we started to hear from China what the regulations or government mandates were, particularly on safety products, I'm going to speak on that one first. What we found was that there were some requirements of how your on the floor and in your office team members had to have safety protocol, what many of you would understand as PPE. Well, you can imagine if you're sitting in China and the government says you need to be doing this now, there's a big driver of get it to me immediately and I'm willing to pay whatever it takes. So shortages developed. What we took was a little different approach. When we started understanding in early January what was going on, we turned down the rest of the world to prepare to support China. And within one day, it was amazing how much material that we had that we were flying over to China to utilize and to distribute to our supply network, to our suppliers, 384 or so, to keep them up and running with one stipulation. Our stuff comes first, right? So we had great response to that, and as a result of that, the China team was able to continue to run and support the rest of the world because our supply base continued to operate. Then that followed on when the COVID moved into Europe. China started to increase their capacities, and then China answered the call, as well did Brazil and North America. And the rest of the world kind of continued to roll forth as the epidemic continued on. On the other side, for our direct material suppliers that were running into similar problems with labor or raw material, as what we called essential industry, because we're part of the food chain, we had the government backing to continue to have our suppliers operate and support for us. So we would, provide the documentation, the legal support, whatever it might be, to enable our supply network to get up and running. What did that show in the eyes of the customer? That one, we cared, we were willing to help. So as the time went on and those different types of constraints propagated across the globe, AGCO was viewed as a customer that was willing to help, willing to invest, and support them in battling that together. So thus becoming a customer of choice and demonstrating a strong level of resilience to what came in our way, kind of like with Mr. Simpson up there.
That's interesting because you had buying power, right? And a lot of big company, right? A lot of our raw materials, you almost could see a bidding war starting, right? Mm-hmm. Agreements we thought we had. Well, wait a minute, somebody else is willing to pay a markup on this, and and one of the things we're trying to do now. Okay, how do we build that into our risk mitigation strategies going forward? How do we consolidate to the right vendor, and how do we get some kind of legal agreement with that vendor? Well, here's the price constraints, especially if it happens again, right? Because if you're selling a car and somebody offers you 10 grand, somebody comes out behind him and says, I'll give you 30 grand for that car, right? What are you going to do?
Right. Yeah. So one of the points you made when we were, initially discussing COVID was, you can't have someone turn a valve, right, when they're mm-hmm. working remotely or if they're out sick. So kind of brings me to my next point, point of disruption, and that's really around sort of the labor issue and supply chain, especially, when you look at warehouses and transportation. Those are two areas where there's been, increased shortages over, the last decades. So how do you plan for these types of labor shortages, and what steps can you take, to sort of reduce the impact on that? Greg, start with you on this one.
Well, that's a wild card, right? Because as you shared a little bit earlier, it's, what's the new crisis of the day? What's the new headwind that you've got to contend with? And for us, one of the big things is how do we become that customer of choice that I mentioned earlier? So we're top of mind for our suppliers, even if we're not the largest. So one of the things that we do is engage with them. What can we do to better help you plan? So forecast accuracy and things like that come into play, but also the ability to invest tooling and capital investments at a level that enables our suppliers to recover, right? We don't want to plan and to have capacity at 100 units per X, and then something happens and they can only produce 85. You don't have the ability to recover. But if you give them the capacity to produce 115 and you only need 100 a day, that's somewhat of an insurance policy, right? And many organizations over the last years with JIT and things like that, and it's the drive to be lean, said that is a waste. Well, over the last 3 or 4 years, we've seen organizations at a very senior level say, we need to invest in our ability to be resilient, to basically be agile, and one way to do that is with additional capacity, right, that you install in your supply network. The other element then of the transportation perspective is with our TMS, we're able to basically pull from our MRP perspective, match that against the dimensions, and provide our carriers on a lane-by-lane basis a 12-month forward-looking level of capacity need that we would need for each one of our 20,000 lanes. Can everybody do that? What does that do? It differentiates you from everybody else. If you become an easier customer to do business with, what happens? Think about that, right? So those are a couple examples. I could give you lots more.
Richard, how about you? Yeah, what did GEON do, or how do you plan for labor shortages?
Yeah, so that, our focus, and I really got to admire our HR guy for that, was on, okay, how do we keep our current people healthy, right? How do we contain, how do we prevent the spread? Because you can't really just go out overnight and hire people to run your line. I mean, they're skilled. This is very skilled work, right? It takes 6-9 months to get somebody from an apprenticeship up until they can run a line on their own. So our whole focus, when they come into the plant, we started with the testing, the masks. We bring in clean as best we can. I don't know the numbers. I don't know if we had a lower spread rate in our plants or not, but that's our focus. How do we keep our labor healthy and able to work?
Mm-hmm. So the last sort of category of disruption that I want to touch on before moving on is around climate change. And so, and climate-related disruptions have impacted supply chains, significantly. There's been port closures based on different weather conditions and variety of climate-related disruptions. So how do you prepare for these types of disruptions? Obviously it's very different than trying to figure out how do you deal with a labor issue. So Richard, start with you. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we just went through that with the winter storm we had out in Ohio, in Cleveland area, right? One of our plants iced over. One of the water mains feeding into the plant busted and flooding. It's like an ice skating rink, right? With our master planner, right? We started looking at we don't look at our products by plant. We look enterprise-wide, right? And we started saying, okay, well, this is the primary location we're going to make a product. What's the secondary? What's the tertiary? And we started talking. Look, weather's coming. You do a risk mitigation. And what if this storm hits? Well, let's move raw materials to this other location, this other plant. We're looking at the whole global asset base and saying, all right, we need alternate manufacturing facilities for each, and we need lanes for all the raw materials, multiple ones going that we can turn on a dime kind of thing.
Great. And Greg, how about you?
So it's somewhat of that insurance policy we talked about a little bit earlier. If I go back in time 4 years ago, how AGCO looked at having that, call it business continuity versus how it is now, really the last 2 or 3 years, there's a huge, huge change. And within that, as we continue to see these weather disruptions, whether it's massive flooding that we've had in Europe a couple of years ago, or the ability in China for them to shut down a vertical industry like castings or forgings because of the pollution, because of a upcoming Winter Olympics or something, all of these things kind of play into asking the question, what if? If there's something that puts you at a severe disruption level because you don't have backup capacity, whether that's human capacity or tool capacity, then you're at risk. And what risk to us is the severity of our ability to provide product to our customers in the production environment or the aftermarket on time. So we're investing millions and millions and millions of dollars into our business continuity plan to ensure that we do not get caught with those, call it things that you have to be resilient to respond to. We want to be agile to plan, to potentially understand what could happen, like yesterday with an earthquake that killed 10,000 plus people in Turkey. Well, I knew within 3 hours basically where I stood in terms of my supply constraint, what other options I had, and within 4 hours I had alternate capacity being ramped up in alternate parts of the world, right? And by the way, that's, the suppliers are impacted are all okay, no one's impacted. But that ability to pull together data, right, in somewhat a resilient fashion is enabled by your ability to design agility into your supply network with data moving quickly, right, and decisions being taken quickly. And I think that is a big piece that many organizations don't understand on the topic of ESG is you don't have a ton of time to take decisions, right? Which means you need to be prepared to act resiliently. That doesn't happen just by chance. That happens by design.
That's a great point. I mean, you remember 20 years ago, you remember this, when the answer to your question was, oh, hell, I'd build inventory. I get thrown out of a company now if I have that answer, right?
Right.
You can't build inventory anymore. But every risk, no, I build inventory, put it in safety stock. No, I can't do that now. And I mean, you gotta have flexibility. The answer to flexibility is, okay, well, it used to be inventory. That's where all my flexibility is, or idle capacity. Can't do that anymore, right? I'm not going to invest in inventory unless I've got some kind of guarantee I'm going to sell it. And if I got idle capacity out there, I better fill it or I better sell it, right? And the way we get around that now is, well, we used to be, you know, okay, well, we didn't have to make these decisions every day. We would make a plan and all right, I just float, live with it. Things have gotten so much faster, and it's the data networks that you're talking about that, all right, I got to make these decisions. I got to do these analysis. I got to do them. I can't wait a month to get them. I got to have them overnight.
Well, I think everything that we've talked about so far, has really brought up the importance of, risk management within supply chains. Mm-hmm. So I want to get an idea of how has sort of, the risk management component of your supply chain shifted. How important is it now? How important do you think it'll be in the future? And, what tools do you have in place for risk management? Greg, you want to take this one first?
So for AGCO, risk management has been what's called an embedded cultural process for well over 10 years. And we were one of the early adopters of that type of software. And it's proven to be, it's paid for itself so many times, because it provides you data really quick, right? It provides you data proactive that you can do some decision making on. For us, the next big challenge is maybe with many of you is understanding that N minus tier, so your supplier supply base, right? So for us, at the tier 1 level, we have, let's call it 3,150 suppliers. On average, each of those have 9.7 suppliers each. So now you're up to, somewhere in the 30,000 plus. Each of them have somewhere in the neighborhood of 12.7 each. So when you start doing the permutations of how much data you've got to basically be able to handle and how many people you've got to be able to oversee that data, it becomes quite immense. So where we're working now is extending our reach in terms of visibility into those most critical tier 2s and tier 3s. And once we understand how to manage that really effectively, then we're going to hopefully get some new technology that can make that easier for us. But if not, we'll continue on that path, because the sooner you understand where that potential risk is, the sooner you can take action. The other side of that, where you actually have risk, that's the sooner you can take decisions, right? Time is money. And time is the most valuable resource that you really can't buy. So you've got to proactively identify how to manage it the most effective way, all right? Understand your risks before they're actual risks.
Yeah, Richard, same question too. How, like, you know,
Yeah, so we've changed our whole planning. I don't, you guys work with an ERP system and all that. It's a one-number plan system, right? It's a budget, or once a month you send a one number through. Well, that one number doesn't work for us anymore. We partner with the John Galt Solutions tool, and we're actually coming in now, instead of a one-number plan, it's a range of plans. We come in with a base case, a best case, and a worst case, right? We build that in the front end in our commercial planning process, demand process. We'll say, okay, base case is going to be analytical, statistically driven. I'm going to look at history, and I'm going to assume that we're going to continue to do what we did in the past. Customer liked the 4 Ps, our price, our product, positioning, promotion. We should be good. Yeah, I mean, we should get an average number, and we'll put a range around that average number with the natural variation. Then we'll feed that. We'll have our sellers take that to the customers, refine it. We'll feed that as a base case through into our operations, and we'll optimize it. Then we'll come back and say, okay, well, wait a minute. Let's talk about best case. Let's talk about worst case. We'll start defining what are the headwinds that'll get us to best case. What are the tailwinds that are going to that could ping us, right? And we'll have the discussions around, well, look, we could have another epidemic or pandemic. Well, what's the odds of that? Well, okay, let's build a plan. In the past, I don't know how many of you have a S&OP monthly process you're running. Took too long to do that, and when you started talking about scenarios, go, well, no, I can't really validate all these different scenarios. Give me one plan, I'm going to validate that. Now with the tools, well, no, I can push scenarios. I can push base case, best case, worst case through. My supply chain can optimize on that base case, and then they can stress test their operations on the best and the worst case, right? You can come back and say, okay, if best case happens, here's where I run out of capacity. Here's where I have to go from 24/5 to 24/7 if best case happens. All right, let's talk about the tailwinds. What are the leading indicators now that are going to tell us 3-4 months ahead of time, give us enough time so that we can pull whatever levers we have to. Same with the worst case. Well, what's our inventory exposure? What's our idle capacity exposure? Well, what are the leading indicators are going to tell us we're heading towards worst case, right? So our whole planning process, we're going to embed that risk. We're going to go in and say, look, what risk are we willing to absorb? What risk do we want to go and work out a plan with our customers and our vendors on the front end, right? Does that make sense?
To follow on that point, I guess, what are those headwinds right now that are sort of
Well, the headwinds is the recovery.
keeping you awake?
Oh, the headwinds. I get headwinds and tailwinds confused. The headwinds, okay, we're in wire and cable business, right? In COVID, everybody, your kids had to go home and work from home, and internet access, really important. I live out in the mountains, pretty remote. I don't have good internet service, right? And I struggle every time I get on a Zoom call to try and keep. Well, all this money was set aside for local governments to go in and put broadband into all these rural communities. A couple of reasons it hadn't. I don't know why the money hadn't been spent, but reasons I hear. Well, even if we spend the money, we can't find people to run the cable. We can't. We don't have companies that can supply up. For us, if that money, if that takes off, we're wire cable. We could triple our volume in our plants, right? And we got to talk. Well, wait a minute. Depending on what happens in D.C., if somebody wins an argument, do we go out and do we start investing like crazy, right? Or how do we know when to prepare for that? The recovery, is it a U-shaped? Is it a V-shaped? Or is it just going to drag along? These are the scenarios we have to build out. And these are the headwinds. We define each of these headwinds. Not all the headwinds we define are going to be significant, right? And you don't define 50 different cases. It's, no, I'm either going to sell more or I'm going to sell less, right? And all these things are cumulative, right? The tailwinds are out there. Tailwinds are out there is, what if tomorrow Congress decides that they're gonna release money back to us and we're gonna have broadband? Hey, we're gonna have a good year. That kind of stuff, right?
How about you, Greg?
So a couple things. Geopolitical risk, right?
Yeah.
Cybersecurity, right? Those two things right now are very relevant in terms of our risks. All of our risks, right? I don't know how many of you have had suppliers within your value chain experience some cybersecurity challenges. That's not a fun thing to go through, right? So recommendation there is if you do have an active supplier engagement or development activity, that you add cybersecurity readiness to what you're assessing and evaluating on, right? That is quite important. The second element then is on the geopolitical activity. And as we've talked a little bit earlier, that insurance policy that says, where is my weakest link within my supply chain? Where am I potentially at a constrained level? And what happens if something happens, right? Whether it's semiconductors in Taiwan or Malaysia or China, might that be some type of challenge for those that buy electrical components? Not just for your tier ones, but for your tier N minus X, right? Pretty rigid. So those would be the two big things.
So I want to shift gears a little bit. Obviously, the overarching theme of this forum is around sustainability, and sustainability certainly works its way into supply chains. It's becoming probably one of the hot button topics that that we are seeing in supply chain. We're writing about it more. We're having more conversations. So I want to get a sense of what are you seeing right now in terms of developing sustainable supply chains, and what's sort of your company's long-term direction, long-term goal, long-term thinking around sustainability within your supply chain. Richard, start with you on this one.
Yeah, so define, how do you measure sustainability, right? To me, and we're changing our whole IBP process. The output of our IBP process needs to be a cash flow statement going out the next 24 months, right? Because cash flow is really what's important. Cash flow is what we're going to use to fund our business and to grow it, reinvest back into our business, and to keep our shareholders happy. So the tools we're working with the John Galt guys, we're building a supply-demand balance model, but it's more than just pounds, right? Now we're starting to put, okay, if any movement of material, I buy material, I move it, I store it, well, there's a cost associated with each of those. So we apply that cost to it, and in my IBP process now, it's just not about balancing supply and demand volumetrically. Now it's, okay, the output of that is, here's my resulting cash flow, right? And so the holy grail to me is I can have a demand manager, a supply manager, a financial analyst looking over each other's shoulder, staring at the same computer screen, and the demand guy's making tweaks saying, well, what if sales did this? What if supply guy, well, what if I rejig the supply chain? What if I produce this here and here? And the financial guy sitting going, well, here's the impact on cash flow for the next 24 months of those decisions, right? And this is how we can build our risks. We can go in there, well, what if this happens? Here's the impact. Here's where we're exposed to inventory. Here's where we just don't have the labor to do it, that kind of stuff. Right? Because I build the constraints. If I can build my supply chain twin model in my demand rough cut, I can build in all my constraints and all these. It's a guy named Dean Sorensen on LinkedIn who does this, calls it unintended consequences. So we make decisions in our demand meetings, in our supply meetings, our IBP process, thinking we're going to get this result, and then when it's all done, well, we look, well, no, we didn't get the result. Well, it's all these unintended consequences that we didn't plan in our models. And we didn't plan them in our models because, well, most of the systems we use to support this are standalone systems we're trying to cobble together. What we're doing now is building out one integrated platform where, okay, no, I don't have to hand something from Salesforce.com over to a forecasting system and then into SAP and then from SAP into Hyperion and then come out a month and a half later, hey, here's the result. Now I can do it. I can do that within a couple of days period. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. I feel like having more and more conversations with companies that are using some sort of digital twin for supply chains to run those what if scenarios. So
That's what I was going to say when Greg was saying that. I mean, that's the speed that he's talking about. The decisions have to be made. Now, I have to have a way to model all the way, some kind of activity-based costing down through every decision I'm making on resolving this risk. What's the impact on my cash flow? And not just over the next 3 months, because things we do everybody, you're all going through this. It's in December, end of December. What do? You cut inventory, right? Well, what do you do in January? Well, we ramp up and try and catch up because we cut our inventory so low in December, right? You have to look at a longer term and say, well, we didn't have to spend all that extra money if we would have just, right-sized our inventory at year end kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And so, Greg, same question to you for ADCO. What are you currently doing from a sustainability standpoint, and what's that long-term vision?
So there's an external piece and an internal piece. I'll start with the internal, Chris. So we started our sustainability journey many, many, many years ago, right? And you think within supply chain, your ability to attack carbon emissions. So how do you do that? You implement systems that optimize your transportation network, maybe on a daily basis, like we did 10 years ago almost. And with that, we can measure the CO2 directly, right, through an accredited source. Same thing on the packaging initiatives. How do you eliminate the wood consumption, cardboard consumption, and move those to sustainable efforts? Like years ago when we went to Good Pack, where instead of for our international shipments, we shipped, traditionally in wood and heavy cardboard and all that. We migrated to a Good Pack concept starting in 2013, and I mean, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of metric tons of waste went away. Significant improvements in our ability to cube out containers increased with reduced CO2, right? So at the very basic, 10 years ago, we were starting to do that. More recently, it's been a focus on our external supply base. How is it that you're able then to understand what they're doing? As under these new Schedule 3 compliance levels, you're able to determine where your biggest waste streams are, where your biggest emissions emitters are. And with that, starting to develop a holistic plan through our NPI development, how do we eliminate some of those wastes or non-ESG friendly designs? How is it that we take proactive decisions on how we can do things better from an environment perspective? Now let's fast forward to the other side of that, right? We are very dependent upon the environment to support our industry, right? Whether it's drought, whether it's rain, whether it's temperatures, our customers basically are feeling that pain. And as a result, as I mentioned earlier, some of the times they have to do things are now reduced, or the conditions, in the case of heat, that they have to operate within are a little bit different. So we work with them to understand how we can help them increase their yields, how we can help them increase carbon sequestration through the photosynthesis process. And as a result of that, we're actually reducing not only the emissions, but increasing the consumption of that carbon that's out there in the air. Not many people have that opportunity. The second element of that strategy is helping them use less material in the fields, whether it's insecticide, whether it's fertilizers, whatever it might be. You may be hearing some really cool buzzwords called precision agriculture, right? And that's taking just massive amounts of data at the plant level and being able to, over the course of years, determine what variability factors impact the yield on that particular plant. So if you've got, 40, 50,000 acres of data, you've probably got more than one soybean plant or corn crop. You've got lots. So having the ability to manage gazillions and gazillions bits of data and turning that into a game plan at the basically within 5 centimeter level of detail, a game plan for the farmer to help them increase their monetization, right? Carbon credits, sale, and all this stuff is part of also our sustainability program. That helps us, that helps them, that helps all of us, because we're consuming carbon that right now is, still a big problem for us globally. So we have a twofold.
Great, thank you. So we've spent a lot of time so far talking about sort of how you react to disruptions, right? And sort of, especially over the last couple of years. So I want to wrap up my prepared questions here by sort of looking to the future. So how are supply chain disruptions impacting investments and then business processes across the organization? And how do you envision, your supply chain of the future? Greg, start with you on this one.
So for us, it's understanding the biggest risk. So where across the 3,150 suppliers do I have capacity constraints versus what my forecasted demand is going to be over the next 5 years? That's what I need to focus on. And getting that up to a level that we're saying is 15% upside minimum, right, on a normal operating condition. So within that, across the supply base, internally as well as externally, we're driving a large group of people coming back with what are our particular constraints, integrating that data into our APS system and having the ability to simulate and scenario plan, what if X happens, where would my 1, 2, 3 constraints be before the demand is there? And as a result of that, we can, through basically the analytics, determine where do we have potential risk points that we need to expand capacity on to match up to our targeted levels of agility, and where we don't necessarily have the ability at that time to ramp up quickly, what would our resilience activities be in order to keep our production lines running, where right now I can't make enough product for the third year in a row, right? Because the products that we're providing to the marketplace help our customers solve their problems, right? That's a good challenge to have when you can't make enough, right? But it's also a bad challenge to have when there's market share out there and you can't capitalize on it because you don't know where your ability is. So back to what we talked a little bit about before, is we're seeing the C-level people taking a more strong conviction on investing in forward-looking capacity in order to create an agile supply chain that enables their businesses to be effective in the global marketplace.
And Richard, what does Geon's supply chain of the future look like?
Yeah, similar. So the big point, collaboration, right? We're trying to break down all these silos within our company, right? You know, commercial, manufacturing, technical, and all that. So, well, no, you can't have these silos now. We got to get to more of a job shop focus from end to end, right? We want our production planners to really understand what the customer wants and what the customer needs. You know, we talk, what are the order winners in there, and as he's working with producing the product. Well, no, okay, now I have a better understanding of what this is going to be used for. Maybe I can take advantage of that and I can tweak, right? Commercial has to really understand cost structure. Now, what it takes to make the products in our plants, right? So they're not out there making agreements that, well, just going to erode our margin. Across the board, everybody, and we're trying to do that now. I mean, you talk about the old S&OP process, it's sequential. No, it's got to be parallel now, right? And you've got to have everybody kind of end-to-end focus. Does that make sense? I can't have my operations group anymore just focused on, I'm minimizing my cost, and I'm just focused in this area when, all right, well, wait a minute, we got growth opportunities over here that you guys are preventing because you're doing that. And vice versa. I don't want to go grow. I don't want commercial group looking at growth opportunities when it says, well, I can't make it, right?
Right. Yep, no, that all makes sense.
Yeah, data, speed, right? We got to, again, it's that holy grail. If I get those three guys looking at the same, business ownership, I got to drive it all the way through down to even the guy who's staging the raw materials for the next week's production. Got to have a business ownership mentality.
Well, I want to thank both of you for sharing your thoughts. You know, we have some time, so if there's any questions from the audience or any comments, or, you know, if you're facing similar challenges, you know, love to hear about it. Yes?
I had a question that was kind of brought up, so thanks guys, great information. I'm curious about sort of managing, you know, sort of the balance of the balance between, you know, kind of getting to that lean manufacturing, sort of like thinking about how can we get our inventories as the working capital as low as possible versus what you were saying, Greg, around sort of being able to be agile and adaptive, right? Because, you know, I think a lot of people that maybe had really lean inventories were caught with their pants down over COVID. And if you just happen to have stuff, then you were, so it's sort of a balance there and there's an optimum. And how do you sort of approach that? It seems like a really difficult problem.
It is, but there's an interesting question that's maybe been brought up in the C-level suites over the last 3 years that wasn't relative to supply chain, and that is, what is the cost if we don't?
Yep.
Right? What is the cost to our customers, to our reputation, to our extended value chain? And I think that balance is starting to come into play. So on certain things, as Richard talked a little bit about as well, is the risk factors playing into the what ifs. And as a result, then coming up with, well, my insurance policy is going to be inventory or resilience. But it can't be, I don't do anything unless, your organization's really not focused on growing or keeping the business.
Yeah, we've actually,
Yes.
we're actually building out those decision trees, right? And we're costing them with the risks. There's, finance guys know how to do this better than I do, but what's the impact? What's the risk of it happening? And you go through and you weight it through there and you say, well, maybe inventory is a cheaper way to carry my risk than I can't sell off an empty shelf kind of thing, right?
Yes.
I have a question for Greg. Very impressive, your capability or the software that you deploy to predict the consequences of the emerging COVID crisis in China. My big question is, how did you get the data? Because the Chinese government was very secretive about all of that. And yes, it's nice to have the data, run it in a model, but hospitalization, all of that, China was very secret. So how did you get that?
They maybe were to you, but when you've got people on the ground there in multiple provinces, you hear things very quickly. So as a result of that learning, if you think of a lessons learned process from a CI perspective, what went right, what went wrong, what do we do differently, how do we get better? Constantly asking that question, you start to move to data. What data is available? What data don't I have? What data do I wish I had? What can I do if I can't get it? So similar to what Richard said, kind of the if-then, programming mentality, that led us to basically ask questions that then led us to get answers and develop solutions. But the core of that, the absolute core of that, was the people. How? Asking the question, how can we, what do we need, how can I? And that then leads to solutions. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But if you don't try, nothing changes.
That's some, I'd say, the future supply chains, right? Data is companies have to start treating data like it is a strategic competitive advantage, just like every other asset out there, right? I think companies need to start investing more and more into data lake, people who understand how to extract information out of all that data, right? Yeah. I think with the technology out there now, you collect data. I mean, think of what Facebook, TikTok, and all that. Think of the data they're collecting on all of us. Well, we had something similar. How much better could we be preparing for any of these risks that happen out there?
Kind of a play on the last question, so more broadly. So what accomplishing this requires data, lots and lots of data. Much of that data resides outside your four walls, either it's from carriers or suppliers or for customers. So what approach did you take to collect the data and contextualize it so you're not walking into meetings, everybody's got different version of the truth. So how do you achieve kind of proverbial single source of truth so you're all acting from similar knowledge about what's going on? Thank you.
Yeah, so master data management, data governance, we've launched those programs, right? And the whole thing is I want a master data hub. I want what would I call a SIM, a customer information master, a product information master. And then, you build it out, you put governance rules on top of it. Getting the data, the hard part is, okay, once I get the data, now how do I turn that data into something meaningful that I can make decisions on, right? But yeah, it's critical. We had the John Galt guys come in and do a readiness step with us, right? And we spent a month with them, and I didn't understand it at first, but we just building out, well, no, here's the data, where is this? We found all kind of things in SAP that said, well, we're not managing the data correctly. We've got to start getting that understanding through to people. Well, no, data is important, and to use the data, it's got to be structured, and it's got to be governed. Does that help?
I'll complement that maybe a bit. And that's understanding what the intended use of that data would be for your business needs. So defining what your requirements are and why, understanding that across the organization, not in a silo, and with that, building out the mindset and culture that we need to be able to quickly take decisions based on accurate data to drive our business to success. And as a result of that, you typically end up getting a different type of, call it response
Yeah.
to, what are you doing to fix your data? What are you doing to improve it? And then the second element, once you've got that kind of holistic understanding, is what and where do we want to be taking decisions from a time perspective? So if I want to be taking decisions in my transportation network 3 months out, 6 months out, 9 months out, what are the dialogues I need to have internally and externally from a structured approach with carriers, right? And understanding what they see as the challenges, active listening. How can we complement each other to develop solutions with that more accurate data to deliver a potential outcome in the face of an event? So establishing a playbook, right? Having the ability to take a decision quickly because you've already asked the question to yourself and to your extended value network. If this happens, what do we do? A, B, or C? Well, if this happens and you don't have a game plan, what happens? Tick, 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 time goes by, right? And you lose your ability. So readiness is really important there.
Yeah, that's a good example of what you said. So the right data, right? There's so much data out there, and a lot of that data is just noise. A lot of the data, if you start reacting to it, well, you're going to be making the wrong decisions. So it's, what is the decision we're trying to make? What is the data I need in order to make that decision, right? A lot of, I mean, people try and get too that's why an ERP system isn't a planning system, right? It's because you can't, you throw every little noise coming out into an ERP system. You're just going to drive people all the way down to your making production orders or cutting purchase orders. You're going to drive them crazy. You have to really understand, well, which data is really impactful going forward.
Yep.
Any other questions for our panelists?
One for y'all. How many of y'all have an S&OP process you're kind of using at your company? Sales and operations planning, a monthly cycle. How many of y'all? You're one? That's surprising.
Richard, this is for you.
Yeah, yeah. Could be true.
Well, okay, so that's a perfect, so sales and operations planning, not from supply chain, right? I mean, that's one of the things in the company. You've got to have this kind of structure. If you had that, you'd understand, well, no, it's not just supply chain or operations, right? It's the whole, it's where we get everybody together and we agree this is our plan going forward for the next foreseeable horizon, right? One of the issues, you used to audit companies with their S&OP, and yeah, it's the same thing. Everybody says, well, no, it's just a supply chain thing, right?
Yeah, for you, Richard. You mentioned that you were what you're doing with your planning is you really care about cash flow.
Mhm.
Most of the companies that I've talked to that have implemented planning solutions, they really care about profitability or margin. So on the cash flow, do you actually have to forecast it? Do you have to forecast how quickly your customers are going to pay you?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have our payment terms all defined in our ERP systems and stuff, right? So I should be able to look at my accounts payable, accounts receivable balance. But those are competitive tools I can use, right? I could go out and say, well, I can get more business if I give this guy longer terms. Well, okay, well, wait a minute, what impact does that have on me, right? Because it does, well, revenue, you got spend. Well, I'm gonna have to float the extra time that I'm allowing them to pay, right? So all those are components of cash flow. And these are the decisions, right? You say competitive stuff. Hey, we can grow our market 10% if I can go and offer these guys 60 days instead of 30-day payment terms. It sounds good, but that extra 10% in revenue, what's that do to me in my working if I'm funding 10% on my working capital, it may not be the right decision. Does that make sense?
Perfect sense, thank you.
Any other questions?
Just a quick question. Are you folks using safety stock that are, like Greg, you mentioned that you're in a position where you're have orders and you can't fulfill them. Is it a constraint based on your suppliers, or is it a constraint based on you internally? I'm just wondering if the stock has gone away, or if you guys still have basically because of the past.
It's a very interesting question, and it's one that I think many of us within the supply, call it chain, have come to question. Because now there's different evaluation criteria. It's not just the standard lead time and transportation. But what about severity of impact? What about actual performance? What about the aggregation of what all of those pieces mean? And then the question becomes, how often do you reassess? So for us, it turns into basically the ability to predict performance from our supply base. So one of the things that we're in the process of doing now is developing a predictive analytical methodology that would take our supply base, look at the different industries each one of them support, and then look at how historically they perform when automotive is up, construction's up, ag's up, whatever it might be, truck, bus, engine, and then take the forward-looking industry estimates of what those industries will be to say, okay, historically, this set of suppliers have a 5% degradation in their on-time and full performance when automotive volumes in this region are above 13 million X. So as a result of that, being able to develop a more intelligent, predictive level of what safety stocks we should be carrying based on historical performance and forward-looking predictive analytics enables us to be better prepared than reactive. That's part of our agility.
On our safety stock is a sin, right? It's dead inventory. We're looking, no, you gotta have safety time. We'll make agreement, like we ABC our customers and our products. We'll go out and we'll work with the customer, and if it's an A customer and he's stable, steady, we'll build a production plan, and we'll get an agreement with that customer that their minimum takes each month, things like that, right? But we're not going to call it safety stock. It's cycle inventory, or it's safety time. It's going to sit there. I can't. A lot of ERP systems, you put in a safety stock and they treat it like it's dead inventory. You can never go below that level. And I go, well, I can't do that anymore, right? It's got to be productive inventory. Does that answer? Okay.
Well, if there's no more questions from the audience, Richard and Greg want to thank you for joining me today. And if anyone out there does have additional questions, don't be afraid to grab any one of us if you see us at the rest of the conference. So thank you.